That loud black bitch. That's what one aide muttered, half smirking, just seconds before room 241 went silent. They didn't expect the folder in her hands to carry a truth worth $3.2 billion or a daughter's name wiped clean from a legacy built on gold, greed, and God complexes. Because in under 43 seconds, Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak. She detonated a secret the Trump dynasty spent 15 years, 4 lawyers, and $750,000 in hush retainers trying to bury. And it all started with one missing name, Tiffany. Let's rewind. It was just after 9 o'clock a.m. in room 241 of the Capitol Oversight Chamber, but time wasn't moving. The air felt colder than the marble floor, the kind of chill that doesn't come from air conditioning. It comes from tension, from truth approaching like a train you can't outrun. The cameras were already on. The C-SPAN light blinked once, then settled into a steady red, the kind that doesn't blink again until someone's life changes. Donald J. Trump sat still, almost regal in posture, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked more like sentries than counsel. He wore that familiar smirk, a blend of confidence, condescension, and calculation, a mask built over decades of lawsuits, press conferences, and stage-managed photo ops. His tie was red, his cufflinks gold, and his voice when he spoke was dipped in faux humility. All my children, he said slowly, deliberately, are equal in my eyes. Always have been, always will be. There was a beat of silence after that line, the kind politicians pray for. 1 second of stillness where the statement can marinate, echo, solidify itself in the minds of viewers. He smiled. Not the soft smile of a father, but the rehearsed grin of a man who had just delivered what he believed would be the closing line of his defense. But not everyone in that room was buying the performance. 3 rows back, sitting unnervingly still, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't moved once during Trump's opening statement. While others scribbled notes, adjusted mics, or whispered to aides, she sat anchored, her hands resting lightly on a slim, battered manila folder, the kind that looked like it had passed through a fire to get here. The corners were frayed, the spine was soft, and her fingers tapped against its cover, not nervously, but methodically, like counting down to detonation. When Chairman Graves leaned forward and said, "Congresswoman Crockett, you may proceed," the air changed, not just in the room, but on the airwaves. Every viewer at home, every reporter on the gallery rail, every camera lens tilted forward. The chamber didn't breathe. It braced. Jasmine rose, slowly, calmly, not like someone heading into battle, like someone who had already won it. The click of her heels against the stone echoed like a gavel in a tomb. She reached the microphone, adjusted it with surgical precision, then looked directly at Trump, eyes steady, jaw set, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous, clarity. "I appreciate your testimony, Mr. President," she began, her voice even, precise, deliberately devoid of emotion, "and your affirmation that all your children are treated equally under your estate structure." Trump nodded, casually, like a man who assumed the next 5 minutes would be painless. Jasmine let the silence linger. Then she said, "Great, because I'd like to enter into the record a document received by this committee from a confidential but verified internal source." She turned to the folder, lifted it, opened it, and everything changed. She removed 3 pages, printed on thick white stock, stapled in the upper left corner, bearing a faint watermark. TTO Holdings Revision Draft 622. She didn't glance down. Her eyes stayed locked on Trump. She raised the first page. "This," she said, holding it between 2 fingers like it might stain her, "is a 2022 amendment to the Trump Family Trust, adjusting the distribution of assets totaling $3.2 billion. Stillness. Trump didn't move. But one of his attorneys shifted just slightly. Jasmine continued, her voice still clinical. "It outlines new allocations for Mr. Donald Trump Jr., Ms. Ivanka Trump, Mr. Eric Trump, and Mr. Barron Trump, each receiving between 20 and 25%, depending on capital market fluctuations. She paused, a surgical pause, the kind taught in trial school when you're about to land a blade. But nowhere in this amendment, she said, is there mention of Tiffany Trump, not a line, not a note, not even a placeholder. Her name, her existence is absent. The room dropped into silence again, but not like before. This time it was graveyard silence, the kind that follows a realization so deep it's physical. The press gallery collectively inhaled. A pen dropped. Somewhere in the back, a cameraman whispered, "Oh, damn." Trump's lips parted, but he said nothing. His face didn't twitch, but his knuckles had gone white on the table edge. "That document," he finally spat, "is stolen, fabricated, illegally obtained. It's slander, and I will not—" "Mr. President," Jasmine cut in, her voice now sharpening like a scalpel, "I never said this came from outside. This revision was pulled directly from internal Trump Organization servers. The metadata is intact, and the signature," she lifted the second page and held it to the camera, "matches your own." She didn't say DJ Trump. She didn't have to. Everyone saw it, in thick red pen, in the bottom right corner, underlined with confidence only a king could afford. DJ Trump. The weight of that signature hung in the air like a noose. Jasmine leaned in just slightly. "So if all your children are equal, why did you erase one?" And in that moment, the myth cracked. The branding, the image, the dynasty. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her words had become an indictment. And Trump, the man who had always controlled the narrative, the camera, the crowd, was suddenly just a father with a pen and a daughter who no longer existed on paper. Because equality isn't declared, it's proven, and the proof was gone. So was her name. Tiffany, erased, but not anymore. Jasmine didn't blink. She stood in the eye of the storm she had just summoned, holding 3 pieces of paper that suddenly felt heavier than the marble beneath her feet. Pages that looked ordinary at first glance, clean, crisp, clipped neatly in the corner with a brass staple, but in the world of dynasties and deception, they were napalm. Page 1, the summary of trust allocations. Page 2, the signature. Page 3, the audit trail, the kind that corporations pray never makes it into daylight. And now all 3 were glowing under the relentless glare of a dozen committee lights, as if the room itself understood that what it held wasn't just evidence, it was an autopsy of power. Jasmine took a breath, the kind of breath you only take when you're about to cut into something sacred. Her voice, still unshaken, carried a new edge. Not anger, not glee, precision. "This document," she said, "reflects the revised structure of the Trump Family Trust, designated under TTO Holdings, dated March 14th, 2022. It itemizes the post-liquidity distribution plan in the event of estate transfer or capital dissolution. The breakdown is clear." She didn't need to say the name slowly, but she did. Donald Trump Jr., 23%. Ivanka Trump, 24%. Eric Trump, 21%. Barron Trump, 20% plus conditional holdings in education reserves. Her finger hovered over the page, drawing invisible lines across generational wealth like a surgeon charting organs before incision. And that's where it ends. Another pause. She tilted the paper toward the audience, not just for the committee, but for every viewer watching live, every retiree in Des Moines, every grandmother in Atlanta, every voter who had once believed in the mythology of a strong, unified Trump family. Her eyes scanned the gallery once before locking on Trump again. There is no mention of Tiffany Trump, not in the margin, not in the footnotes, not even in placeholder language. A daughter's name, omitted like it never belonged. You could feel it in the room, a tension so sharp it could sever breath. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Phones vibrated silently in staffers' pockets, but no one dared look away. It was like watching a photograph get burned in real time. Trump clenched his fists. That smirk, the one he'd worn like armor for decades, was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Silence. controlled but cracking. His lawyer to the left shifted in his seat, subtly, just enough to signal he was preparing for impact. On C-SPAN, the frame held tight on Trump's face, refusing to cut away. America saw everything, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't gloat, she didn't raise her voice. That wasn't her style. Her weapon wasn't volume, it was truth delivered like a scalpel. And she wielded it with the ease of someone who'd already rehearsed this moment not once, but 100 times in her head. "Mr. President," she said, letting the words fall like a gavel, "if you truly believe all your children are equal—" She paused, not for drama, but for gravity. "Then where is Tiffany?" The question cracked through the chamber like lightning tearing through oak. It wasn't rhetorical, it was an accusation, dressed in plain language, so direct and surgical, it didn't require emotion. Just silence. Trump leaned forward as if to respond, but no words came. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The room watched the once untouchable titan of branding, media, and myth-making sit mute under the weight of the very legacy he'd crafted. Crockett stepped aside slightly, allowing the overhead projector to catch the corner of the page now placed beneath the document cam. Across the screen, viewers at home could see the red pen/DJ. Trump scrawled confidently at the base of a document that had erased his own daughter like a typo. You could almost hear it, millions of viewers gasping, not because they were shocked, but because deep down they weren't. They just didn't think anyone would ever have the guts to say it. Jasmine pressed on. The metadata from the file confirms internal drafting. Timestamped during a review session with Trump Organization Legal on March 13th, 6:42 p.m. Eastern. Furthermore, server logs indicate revisions tagged by an account labeled DJT Exec Holdings at TTU.net. Forensics matched the origin to internal IP addresses registered to Trump Tower, New York. Now she was burying them, not with fire, but with facts. Her voice remained composed, but every sentence stripped another layer off the illusion. This isn't just a mistake. It wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, calculated, approved. Trump's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering quickly, urgently, but Trump didn't move. His hands were still balled into fists, his lips pressed into a single flat line. He looked less like a former president and more like a man standing over the grave of his own myth, one he had dug with gold and now couldn't climb out of. And Jasmine? She waited, not for applause, not for a reaction, for the weight of truth to land. She looked at the room, not with fire but with finality, and said, "If this document is a family portrait, then Tiffany Trump has been airbrushed out, and the only hand holding the eraser is yours." There was no need to shout. When the truth is sharp enough, you whisper it, and it still cuts. But Jasmine wasn't the first to bleed from that blade. Long before the folder made its way to the Oversight Committee, before Tiffany's name vanished from a billion-dollar inheritance, and long before America even knew there was a story to tell, there was Richard Wilkes, a man without headlines, without a face the press could name. But within the Trump empire, Richard was legend. They called him the Iron Pen, because whatever he drafted never leaked, never cracked, and never got questioned. For 23 years, he ghostwrote security into every document Trump needed to keep the family kingdom polished, private, and profitable. If you wanted a clause buried, a deal sanitized, or a legacy made lawsuit-proof, you didn't call a PR firm. You called Richard. He wasn't glamorous. He didn't wear flashy suits or trade gossip at Mar-a-Lago dinners. He was the vault, the silent hinge behind every signature that mattered. And until one night in late 2021, he thought he could keep it that way. It was a Thursday, 9:37 p.m. Florida time. Richard was at home, curled on a leather couch with case files glowing from a dim tablet. His wife had gone to bed an hour earlier. The only sound in the room was the hum of a ceiling fan and the occasional ice clink from his untouched bourbon. Then the private line rang, the one that almost never did. He stared at it for 2 full rings, then answered, "Yes, sir." Trump's voice came through the line, Not distracted or boastful like usual, but low, cold, all business. We need to restructure the trust. Richard blinked, already reaching for a pen. Which part? A pause, a breath, then words delivered like a guillotine. Cut Tiffany out. Richard sat forward. Sir? She's soft, Trump said, faster now, like a man pushing through something unpleasant. Not on brand, doesn't test well. She dated a Democrat. She's dead weight. It wasn't rage, it wasn't personal. It was marketing. Richard didn't answer right away. And that silence, that heartbeat of hesitation, was the moment his job ended and something else began. She's your daughter, he said quietly. There was a longer pause on the other end now. Then came the reply, calculated, brutal, sterile. She's a liability. This isn't about love, Richard. This is about optics. Be polite. Give her something small, symbolic. You know how to write it. And just like that, the line went dead. Richard stared at the dark screen in his hand, then at the cursor blinking on his legal tablet. He didn't move for nearly 5 minutes. Somewhere behind him, the ice in his drink finally cracked. The next morning, he drafted the revision. 12 pages. Meticulous. Elegant. Emotionless. Tiffany Trump's name was erased from every major holding, every equity provision, every generational clause. In place of full inclusion, a single line in small, italicized text. One-time goodwill allocation of $50,000. It was surgical, just as requested. And yet something inside Richard had shifted. He'd written off bankruptcies. He'd designed clauses to silence mistresses. He'd turned dirty deals into clean slates. But this was different. This wasn't just legal. It was betrayal printed on fine paper. He stared at the draft for hours before submitting it. When he finally sent it to the legal chain, he also did something he had never done before. He printed a personal copy, not to leak, not to sell, but to remember. He put it in an envelope and slid it into his home safe, tucked behind his late mother's will and his son's college acceptance letter. He labeled it in blocky black ink, R. Whitmore, a pseudonym only he would recognize. Because for the first time in 2 decades, Richard wasn't just documenting decisions. He was archiving guilt. Over the next few months, he started going back, quietly, carefully, opening old revisions, checking digital logs, rereading language he had once written without flinching. The trust amendments, the payout modifiers, the internal memos that never made it past legal. And what he saw time and again was a pattern. Erasure wasn't rare. It was policy. If someone didn't serve the brand, they were trimmed from the story, snipped like a loose thread, then swept under by silence and NDAs. By spring 2022, Richard had assembled a quiet collection. Not because he planned to expose anything. He wasn't brave enough for that. Not yet. But because somewhere deep in his conscience, the vault had cracked. And when a vault cracks just right, even silence begins to whisper. So when the envelope arrived at Jasmine Crockett's office, no return address, no fingerprints, just weight. In truth, she wasn't the only one holding her breath. Richard watched the news from his study that morning, the screen flickering softly as C-SPAN cut to room 241. He saw the folder, saw the document, saw her rise without a tremble, speak without stuttering, and turn silence into testimony. He didn't flinch when the papers were raised. He didn't look away when the signature appeared. But when she uttered the question, the one no dynasty ever expects to be asked in daylight, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, breath caught somewhere between regret and reckoning. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking to be counted. And he, of all people, knew what it meant to be quietly erased. He didn't cry, but for the first time in 23 years, he heard the echo of everything he helped redact finally speak back. That echo stretched far beyond marble walls and courtrooms. It reached backward, into memory, into private wounds wrapped in velvet, and it found her. 18 years old, alone in a penthouse lined with chandeliers and silent staff, A room built to impress, but never to embrace. Her birthday had come with no celebration, no hugs, no father holding her shoulders and saying he was proud. Instead, there was only an envelope. It arrived by courier, placed carefully on a tray of untouched strawberries, thick paper, custom embossed, no return address, just a handwritten note inside, clipped to a single check for $50,000. The words weren't cruel. That would have at least implied emotion. They were worse, detached, precise. Use this wisely. It's a gesture. Not love, not inheritance. A gesture. She read the note once, then again, then folded it quietly and slipped it back into the envelope. She didn't rip it, didn't scream. There was no one there to hear it if she had, just the steady hum of central air and the weight of being tolerated, but never chosen. Outside, Fifth Avenue sparkled like gold-plated approval. Inside, she sat in a chair worth more than some families make in a year, but her eyes were unfocused, gazing past the skyline, past the wealth, into something rawer, a hollow not shaped by what was absent, but by what had never truly been present. She didn't want the money. She wanted to matter. And in that moment, she understood something most children never have to learn on their birthday. That even in families, some people are born as assets, and others are born inconvenient. The staff gave her space, a polite distance that had always been there. No one asked if she wanted cake. No one lit candles. No one asked what it felt like to receive a father's affection reduced to a transaction and sealed in custom stationery. That night, she left the check untouched. She placed it in a drawer, one she rarely opened, next to a faded photo of her as a child, taken at Mar-a-Lago, where she was standing 2 feet behind everyone else. Not by design, just forgotten in the frame. Years later, when she would speak under oath, her voice wouldn't shake. But inside that memory still lived, unburned, unshredded. She kept it not for vengeance, not to prove anything. She kept it because sometimes the cruelest kind of absence is the one that's written down, not yelling, not slamming doors, just paper. And when the news broke, when she saw the trust amendment for the first time, her name missing like it had never existed, it didn't sting because it was new. It stung because it wasn't. This wasn't erasure, it was confirmation. A quiet reinforcement of what she had been told, subtly, repeatedly, by every schedule conflict, every missed birthday call, every mention of her siblings on television, while her name was always last, if it was mentioned at all. In the press, she was the private one. Low profile, quiet, but she wasn't quiet by nature. She was quiet by design, trained to be. Because when you grow up knowing your voice isn't expected to matter, eventually, you learn how to hold it in. Her mother told her once gently, visibility isn't always love, and she believed it. But even invisible daughters remember. And that memory wasn't an event. It was a pattern, a lifetime of being kept at the periphery of something she never asked to dominate, just to be allowed into. She didn't want the cameras or the magazine spreads. She just wanted to be counted. But instead, she had an envelope, one check, one note, one unspoken message written in omission. You are not part of the plan. She folded it back up that night and tucked it into the same drawer. But this time, she wrote one thing on the back of the envelope in a pen that bled a little through the paper. Just in case. Not in case of lawyers, not in case of press, in case someone someday dared to ask if she had ever known. And when Jasmine Crockett said the words on national television, when her name was finally spoken, not as an afterthought, but as a challenge, she felt the drawer unlock inside her. She didn't smile, but for the first time in her life, she felt seen, because she had palaces, but never a place. And now, maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of one. A continent away, while the nation remained unaware of what was quietly unraveling beneath the Trump mythos, Jasmine Crockett arrived at her Capitol Hill office before sunrise. The building was still asleep, the marble halls dim and hollow, the kind of stillness that felt more like warning than peace. She liked the quiet hours before politics awoke. Before the noise, the theater, the half-truths made themselves loud. But this morning was different. Her assistant hadn't arrived yet. The floor was empty. No footsteps, no phones ringing, just the low hum of power settling in for another day of performances. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, expecting nothing more than a desk full of reports and policy drafts. But instead, she stopped cold. On the floor, directly in front of her office chair, lay a single envelope. Thick, heavy, sealed in black wax. No stamp, no address, no logo, just her name. Written in sharp, deliberate capital letters across the center. Crockett. She didn't touch it at first. She just stared. It had been placed too precisely, not slid under like a mailer, but placed dead center. It wasn't a threat. It didn't feel rushed. It felt surgical, like whoever left it knew exactly where it would land and exactly what it would do once it did. She reached down slowly and picked it up. The weight of it surprised her. Not metaphorically. Finally, this wasn't a few sheets of paper. This was a burden waiting to become a bomb. She closed the blinds, locked the door, sat down, and only then did she break the seal. The scent of printer ink and archival paper hit first. Dry, sterile, familiar. She had read thousands of government documents in her life, but not like these. The first item, a 3-page revision of the Trump Family Trust, TTO Holdings, Reverend Draft 622. It was the same version she would one day hold before the entire Oversight Committee. But today, it was just her and the truth. The second, 3 legal billing receipts. Each dated, each signed, one line item, asset exclusion, Tier 5 family, TT. Another, courier delivery, Mar-a-Lago, hand confirmed. And the third item, the one that made her stop breathing for a full second, was a single sheet, a memo. Not typed, not formal, just scanned, crooked, uneven. On top, the faint watermark of the Trump Organization. At the bottom, handwritten in red ink, underlined once, no legacy for liabilities. She didn't move. She didn't shout. She didn't grab her phone or call her chief of staff or text her legal aid. She just sat there, hands resting on the edges of the desk, eyes locked on that one phrase, over and over, as if the page might whisper more if she stared long enough. It didn't. It had already said enough. This wasn't paper. It was a confession dressed in Helvetica, a daughter's name erased, not by accident, but by executive choice. And this envelope, wasn't sent by someone looking to make noise. It was from someone who understood that the most dangerous kind of truth is the one that shows up uninvited. And Jasmine, she didn't react like a politician. She reacted like a woman who had been waiting her entire career for this kind of reckoning. Quietly, calmly, like a bomb tech learning how to defuse something that was never supposed to be found. She examined the handwriting on the memo. She traced the metadata on the revision. She checked the courier service listed on the receipts. Nothing felt fake. Everything felt intentional. This wasn't some whistleblower trying to stir chaos. This was someone on the inside, someone who knew exactly what to extract and how to make it undeniable. And they had chosen her, not because she was loud, not because she was flashy, but because Jasmine Crockett had made one thing clear from the day she stepped into Congress. She would never sit down for legacy, not if it meant stepping over truth. She sat with the envelope for nearly an hour, didn't touch her coffee, didn't check the news cycle, just let it exist. Let it shift the air in the room. Let it settle into her bones like a second heartbeat. Then, with hands steadier than she expected, she placed all 3 documents back into the envelope, resealed it with a strip of packing tape from her drawer, and slid it into her private safe. She didn't file a complaint. She didn't leak it. She didn't tweet. She waited. She waited because some truths are too big for reaction. They require preparation. And Jasmine Crockett was preparing for war, because that envelope wasn't a briefing. It was a blade, wrapped in velvet, sharpened by omission, and forged in the silence of a daughter who had waited her entire life to be counted. The next move would be hers, and she would make it count. But not quickly. Jasmine Crockett had never been the kind of politician who rushed for a headline. She didn't chase sound bites or drop half-verified scandals into hungry hands. Because for her, truth wasn't a tool, it was ordnance. And you don't toss explosives. You plant them carefully, deep, where no one can dig them out once they detonate. So she didn't release the documents. Not to her staff, not to friendly media, not even to the House Oversight Subcommittee, Whisper Network, always hunting for a scandal to weaponize. She didn't even make a copy. Instead, she moved like a surgeon, prepping for a high-risk operation in absolute silence. First came the forensics. She hired a third-party analyst, one she trusted, one with no political affiliations, to verify the digital trail. The metadata on the trust revision matched the signature timestamp. March 14, 222, 6:42 p.m. East Asian internal server logs aligned with a secure terminal in Trump Tower, listed under DJT Exec Holdings. The billing receipts, once scanned into a forensic database, revealed hidden tags linking them to a Mar-a-Lago secure archive. And the handwriting? It was run through both commercial and congressional graphology tools. Conclusion: 98.9% match. The red ink belonged to Donald J. Trump. No speculation, no conspiracy, just confirmation. Second came the decision, and it wasn't about law, it was about timing. Jasmine kept the envelope in a private safe behind a panel in her bookshelf, one only she could open. It sat directly beneath two things that didn't belong to any political party: her father's Bronze Star and the last handwritten cornbread recipe her mother ever gave her. Because this wasn't politics, it was legacy warfare. She remembered her father's voice. You don't bring a gun to a chess match, baby. You bring patience. So she waited for 3 full weeks, 3 weeks of hearings, headlines, and noise. While Washington spun around her in cycles of performative outrage and curated empathy, she moved in total quiet, watching, listening, mapping every piece on the board. She didn't drop hints. She didn't play coy. She studied the moves of her opponent, the way Trump deflected, the way his lawyers crafted every sentence like armor, always assuming no one would ever see what was scrawled in blood just beneath the gold. But she had seen it, and she wasn't just preparing to reveal it, she was preparing to prove it. Late at night, when her office was empty, she'd take the envelope out just for a moment. Not to read, just to feel the weight again. To remind herself that this wasn't about exposure. It was about obligation. A daughter had been erased. Not because she was dangerous, but because she wasn't useful. Because she didn't poll well. Because she wasn't profitable. And Jasmine knew, deep in her bones, that this wasn't just about Tiffany. It was about every name ever crossed out of a story, because it didn't serve the author's brand. So she waited. And while she waited, she prepared. Quietly, she ordered transcripts from previous hearings involving estate fraud. She reviewed congressional protocols for evidence admission. She researched the legal boundaries of whistleblower protections, even when the whistleblower never speaks. She looped in exactly one person, her personal attorney. No names, no emails. One meeting, one question. If I'm sued, will it hold? The answer, if you have what you say you have, yes. She left the meeting with nothing but silence and certainty. And when the day finally came, when the hearing agenda dropped and she saw Trump's name placed neatly in black ink under voluntary witness testimony, she didn't blink. She didn't adjust her schedule. She simply walked back into her office, pulled the envelope from the safe, and slid it into her bag beneath a copy of the U.S. Constitution. She didn't tell her team, she didn't alert the press, because truth isn't shouted, it's deployed. And Jasmine Crockett was about to launch something the Trump dynasty never planned for: a receipt forged in their own ink, signed with their own hand, and buried by a man who never imagined someone like her would ever dare dig it back up. 3 weeks of silence, 3 weeks of calculation, 3 weeks of waiting while the world spun on, unaware that one envelope, unbranded, unstamped, and unbothered, was ticking like a clock in her bag. She didn't want applause. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the erasure to end, and she knew, to end a dynasty, you don't scream, you wait, you move. And then, when the air is still, you strike. But even the sharpest strike needs backup. And Jasmine Crockett had learned long ago, the truth hits harder when someone who once helped bury it comes back to help exhume it. The call to Michael Cohen wasn't long. It didn't need to be. She didn't threaten. She didn't plead. She simply said what only someone who had seen the documents could say. Did you send it? There was a pause on the line, just long enough to taste the past. Then came his voice, gravelly, resigned. Come alone. No cameras, no lawyers, no bullshit. They met the next night in the back booth of a diner in the Bronx. Not the renovated kind with hipster menus and chrome counters. This one had flickering lights, menus laminated 2 decades ago, and a waitress who didn't ask questions because she'd seen everything already. Jasmine arrived in black denim, a leather coat zipped halfway, and no makeup. She looked like someone who wasn't there to be recognized, just remembered. Cohen was already seated, back to the wall, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. He didn't smile when she sat. He just nodded once and slid a napkin dispenser aside to make room between them. You know, he began, staring past her at nothing in particular, I used to be proud of how many fires I put out for him. Thought I was protecting something worth saving. He paused. Turns out I was just pouring gasoline with both hands. Jasmine said nothing. She let him unravel. People like Cohen didn't confess because they were asked to. They did it because the weight finally got too loud to carry. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small black USB drive, and placed it between them on the table. I recorded the call, he said. He was watching cable news when he said it. Eating ice cream. Laughing. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Said what, exactly? Cohen didn't blink. His voice dropped low. Cut her out. Give her something symbolic. She's not campaign material. He shook his head. Those were his words, not mine. Jasmine picked up the drive but didn't pocket it. Not yet. She stared at it, as if expecting it to burn through her palm. How many people know? Not many, he said. Not the full thing. But you're not the only one who's been waiting for the right time. She looked at him, searching for the man behind the broken allegiance. The fixer, the enabler, the one who once called congressional hearings a circus and perjury a skill set. You helped him write the trust revision? I wrote it, Cohen replied. Every clause, every removal, every line of legal language that made it sound less like abandonment and more like administrative necessity. She leaned back, breath slow, steady. Why now? Cohen didn't hesitate. Because I spent 10 years being at his echo. I lied under oath. I protected the mask. But that girl, he looked at her now, really looked. She wasn't erased because she failed him. She was erased because she embarrassed the brand. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, grimaced. It wasn't a will, Congresswoman. It was a branding decision. The words hung there, heavy, stinging, true. Jasmine finally slid the USB into her coat pocket. Does he know you kept this? No, Cohen replied, because he thinks loyalty is forever. He thinks everyone he breaks stays broken. And are you? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. No, but I am finished. She nodded once. That was enough. As she stood to leave, Cohen grabbed her wrist, not hard, just firm. When you play this, don't expect remorse. He doesn't say it like it's cruel. He says it like it's obvious, like it's a strategy. Jasmine looked down at his hand, then back at him. That's the most terrifying part. He let go. Outside, the city breathed like it always had, horns wailing in the distance, air thick with exhaust and exhaustion. But inside that little diner, something irreversible had changed. The man who had spent a decade shielding a titan had handed over the one thing even Trump couldn't bury, his own voice, spelling out the erasure of his own blood. The reversal was complete. The man who once protected the lie was now holding up the mirror, and Jasmine Crockett had everything she needed to turn that reflection into a reckoning. The hearing room was packed, not with tourists or interns or passersby looking for spectacle. It was filled with tension, pressurized, electric, the kind that makes even seasoned politicians sit straighter. You could feel the weight of it pressing into the mahogany furniture and the polished marble floors. C-SPAN's red light blinked once, then stayed solid. The country was watching. At the center of the room sat Donald J. Trump, flanked by his lawyers, fingers drumming the oak table with the precision of a man used to controlling the pace of every room he entered. His expression was unreadable, not because it was blank, but because it was practiced. He had smirked his way through scandals, lawsuits, and subpoenas. He thought this would be no different. But Jasmine Crockett stood across from him with something far more dangerous than anger. Evidence. She approached the microphone like a conductor approaching a crescendo. Calm, deliberate. Her notes were minimal. Her folder, sealed in red tape, was thicker now. Not with speculation, not with rumor, but with receipts. The trust revision, the billing slips, the internal memo, and now, Cohen's voice. "I'd like to submit to the record," she began. "Exhibit C, an audio file timestamped March 14th, 2022, 6:43 p.m., originating from a private line located inside Trump Tower." She paused, glancing at the committee. The voice is verified through forensic analysis and matches prior recordings of Mr. Donald J. Trump. She tapped a button on the desk. The speakers came alive. At first, just static. Then, cut her out. Give her something symbolic. She's not campaign material. A pause, then a chuckle. Low, unbothered. "Tiffany's never been part of the brand. You don't carry dead weight into legacy." The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence was more deafening than shock. Jasmine leaned slightly into the mic, her voice steady. "Mr. Trump, do you deny that's your voice?" Trump slammed his palm on the table. "Fake. It's fake. Deep fake. AI crap. You people will believe anything." But no one moved to silence Jasmine. The room had shifted. Truth, once whispered, was now holding court. Jasmine let his outburst fade, then continued. "In addition to the voice recording, we have signed revisions to the Trump Family Trust, legal correspondence verifying intent to exclude, and documentation that proves this was not a legal necessity, but a deliberate personal choice, executed not as a father, but as a brand manager." Across the room, cameras clicked like gunfire. Then came the final moment. Jasmine stepped back and nodded toward the chamber doors. They opened, and in walked the forgotten. Tiffany Trump, alone, no security detail, no designer entourage, no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot. Her black blazer was simple, severe, nearly funereal. She looked not like someone arriving for drama, but like someone finally arriving for herself. Trump's face twitched, just for a second, a crack beneath the practiced mask. Tiffany didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward. A staffer guided her to the witness seat. She placed both hands flat on the table. When the chairman asked if she would swear to tell the truth, she answered, "I do." Her voice was soft but unshaken. The chamber waited. "I wasn't erased from the money," she said after a long pause. "I was erased from the memory." Nothing moved. No one breathed. "I was called low profile, quiet, independent. But I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I wasn't expected to be part of the story." Jasmine watched her but didn't speak. This was not her moment to lead. It was Tiffany's. The one who had been branded irrelevant was now the one forcing the entire country to listen. "I'm not angry," she continued, eyes locking with the committee now. "I'm tired. Tired of pretending that being ignored was dignity. Tired of watching my father refer to his children as legacy assets. Tired of being told that loyalty is silence." Trump fumed. His lawyer whispered frantically. But he didn't interrupt, because interrupting her would mean acknowledging her. And for decades, he had avoided doing exactly that. "This wasn't about inheritance," Tiffany said. "It was about hierarchy, image, obedience. And I didn't fit the frame, so I was cropped out." She turned her head, finally, just slightly toward her father. I'm not here to ask for anything, not money, not apology. I'm just here to say it clearly so no one ever questions it again. I was erased. The room felt colder somehow. Still, and Jasmine Crockett, standing off to the side, knew it had landed. Not because the words were loud, but because they were undeniable. Silence had finally spoken, and it had roared. The clip went viral before she even stepped outside the chamber. Tiffany's voice, clear, contained, devastating, looped across screens nationwide. On cable news, in Facebook groups, in whispered phone calls from Florida to Fresno, one phrase repeated like gospel: I wasn't erased from the money, I was erased from the memory. By sundown, hashtags flooded the web. I'd erased, but not gone, the forgotten daughter, hashtag Crockett was power. And that night, somewhere behind closed doors in one of his gilded properties, Donald Trump made a decision that revealed far more than he realized. He filed a lawsuit, $125 million, filed in federal court within 24 hours. 3 counts: defamation, illegal disclosure of private documents, and, most theatrically, emotional terrorism. The legal filing read less like a court document and more like a PR grenade. He accused Jasmine of orchestrating a smear campaign. He accused her of conspiring with disgruntled former associates. He accused her of weaponizing family. And finally, he accused her of irreparably damaging the integrity of the Trump legacy. The press devoured it. Headlines lit up in every direction. Trump sues Congresswoman for $125 over trust exposed terrorism air in the courtroom. Trump fights back Jasmine Crockett accused of a political assassination. But while pundits bickered and headlines screamed, Jasmine Crockett didn't panic. She didn't hide, she didn't even blink. She stood on the Capitol steps, flanked by no one, her coat still half-buttoned, her phone in one hand. And when a CNN reporter shouted, "Congresswoman, do you have a response to the lawsuit?" she looked directly at the camera and said, "He sued me because I wouldn't stay silent." That clip, only 7 seconds long, rippled like lightning. By midnight, it had been shared 9 million times. By morning, the Capitol mailroom began to flood, not with press releases, not with donation checks, with letters, handwritten, stamped, folded carefully by people who still knew how to write in cursive. Most came from one group: Americans over 50, veterans, nurses, librarians, widows, teachers, people who had been daughters, people who had been erased. They wrote things like, "My father cut me out when I spoke up about abuse. My sister was the good daughter. I was the quiet one. Thank you for letting the forgotten be seen." Some came in envelopes with Bible verses taped to the flap. Some came in legal stationery. One woman sent a yellowed photo of her as a child, scribbled on the back, "For the daughter he wouldn't frame." Jasmine read every one. Her staff built a separate cabinet just to store them. They called it the reckoning drawer. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down. He tweeted clips of pundits calling Jasmine radical. He appeared on cable to say she staged a moment of betrayal. He claimed Tiffany had been brainwashed by media snakes. But each time he spoke, the blowback worsened. Because no matter how much money he threw at it, there was one thing he couldn't control: the look in Tiffany's eyes when she told the world she'd been forgotten. And more importantly, the way millions of Americans recognized themselves in her silence. Jasmine filed a motion to dismiss. But her response wasn't just legal, it was cultural. She wrote in her public statement, "This is not about inheritance. This is about dignity. I didn't reveal secrets, I revealed patterns. The lawsuit isn't justice, it's retaliation." And the public agreed. Church groups made statements. Civil rights organizations released open letters. Even a group of Gold Star mothers issued a statement of support, writing, "A daughter's voice is not defamation, it's sacred." By the end of the week, public pressure boiled over. The New York Times ran an op-ed titled, "When Silence is the Real Terrorism." And the lawsuit, once filed to silence Jasmine, had done the opposite. It elevated her to a symbol, not of resistance, but of recognition, because people didn't see her as a politician anymore. They saw her as a mirror, reflecting back every daughter, every son, every person who'd ever been told, you don't fit the brand, you don't belong in the legacy. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about justice. And the line had been drawn, not with ink, with echo. And Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, stood on the side of that line with the truth in one hand and an army of the forgotten behind her. But every empire has its fault line, and the Trump brand, long built on gold facades and manicured myths, was about to split right down the center. It started quietly, as it always does. A file, a forward, a screenshot so sharp it didn't need commentary, leaked from deep inside Trump Organization's internal archives, time-stamped 3 months before the trust revision was finalized. The subject line was innocuous: TTO family strategy, Q2 realignment. But the contents, pure detonation. At the top of the memo, typed in clinical black sans serif, reevaluate Tiffany, and beneath it, a cold bullet point. Demographic doesn't align with core donor expectations. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't gossip. It was strategy. The kind drafted behind frosted glass boardroom doors, not family dinners. The kind that replaced names with variables, affection with optics, and bloodlines with marketing segments. Another line read, exclude to avoid optics risk. Focus on brand-aligned heirs. No warmth, no pretense, no heart. Just language so sanitized it bled. Within hours, the memo swept across media channels. It wasn't the kind of leak that needed interpretation. It was self-executing. No anonymous sources. No need for pundits to argue over what it meant. It was right there in black and white. Exclude to avoid optics risk. Suddenly, Jasmine Crockett's testimony wasn't just compelling, it was corroborated. Suddenly, Tiffany Trump's words weren't just emotional, they were evidentiary. And suddenly, the myth, that carefully maintained narrative of a tight-knit Trump clan standing in golden unity, collapsed like wet drywall. The headlines weren't just political, they were personal. Trump brand memos reveal calculated daughter erasure. Washington Post. Not strategic enough for the legacy? Internal docs say yes. Rolling Stone. She's not the right demographic. The memo that turned silence into scandal. Time cameras camped outside Trump Tower. Former aides dodged press, and the press, they dug deeper. No one could deny it now. The phrase wasn't metaphorical, it was policy. The Trump camp refused to respond. Press inquiries were stonewalled. Legal teams deflected. And when asked directly by reporters as she exited a fundraiser, Melania Trump offered only 2 words. No comment. It landed like thunder. Because when silence follows strategy, it isn't ignorance, it's complicity. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing at first. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. But her staff noticed a shift in her office that morning. She arrived early, alone, walked to her desk, and before she sat down, she opened the drawer where she kept the letters. The handwritten ones, the folded ones, the ones that smelled faintly of old stationery and stronger memories. She placed the memo next to them and closed the drawer gently, because it belonged there, with the confessions, with the heartbreak, with the other wounds made invisible by people who thought silence was strategy. But the memo didn't stay hidden for long. Protest signs went up across the country. In Detroit, exclude me and watch me speak louder. Yes, in Atlanta, not demographic enough, but still my father's daughter. In Philadelphia, a mural went up overnight. Tiffany's face in grayscale, overlaid with the memo quote, optics risk. That phrase was no longer a brand guideline. It was a rallying cry. And while Trump stayed silent, the brand bled. Because no matter how many lawyers he hired or statements he buried, or tweets he fired out in the middle of the night, he couldn't scrub what had finally broken through. That Tiffany hadn't been excluded because she failed the family. She'd been excluded because she failed the fantasy, A dynasty doesn't crumble from fire. It crumbles from fracture. And Jasmine hadn't caused it. She'd only held up the mirror. Now the world was looking. And the myth, the polished, gleaming, photo-ready myth, was cracking right down the center. Not from outside, from within. And this time, no amount of gold could seal it shut. 3 weeks later, room 241 wasn't just a hearing room. It was a reckoning hall. The House Oversight Committee reconvened under a new title, Ethics in Family Governance. It sounded sterile on paper, but everyone knew what it meant. This wasn't about tax codes or inheritance law. This was about power, blood, and the stories we silence to keep legacies pretty. The gallery filled early, not just with media and lobbyists this time, but with something heavier. Civil rights organizers, child welfare advocates, survivors, generations. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats. This wasn't going to be a legal hearing. It was going to be a mirror. Jasmine Crockett walked into the room carrying a single file folder. It wasn't thick, it wasn't dramatic, but what it held was enough to tilt the chamber on its axis. She opened it and placed the contents on the table, then looked up, unflinching. These, she said, are letters, not from staffers, not from lawyers, from people across this country who saw what happened and recognized themselves in the silence. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her hands moved gently, unfolding 3 pieces of paper, aged, ink-smudged, written in cursive that trembled with memory. The first, she began, comes from a woman in rural Texas, a daughter of a former state senator. She was removed from his will after testifying in support of survivors of abuse. He said she'd complicated his campaign image. Gasps flickered across the gallery like sparks. Jasmine didn't flinch. The second, she continued, comes from an undocumented woman in New York. Her father, a major donor to a political machine, acknowledged her privately but never publicly. She worked 3 jobs through college. At graduation, he didn't show. The silence deepened, not out of shock, but because too many people had lived versions of the same story. And the third, Jasmine said softly, from a woman in Georgia. He said I was too emotional to be an heir. I guess tears don't look good in campaign ads. She paused, let the weight settle. Then she looked at the full panel, not just the usual suspects in suits, but the entire nation, watching through flickering screens and live streams in homes, churches, waiting rooms, and nursing homes. I ask this committee today, before we debate legalities, before we dissect reputations, to consider one question. She stepped forward, palms open, voice low but unwavering. How many daughters have been left out? Not because they failed their families, but because they didn't fit the brand. Not a murmur, not a breath. Because when a question is that true, it doesn't need applause. It just lands. Jasmine scanned the room. Her eyes didn't beg. They challenged. She wasn't offering pity. She was demanding perspective. This hearing is not about Donald Trump, not anymore. He is not the disease. He is the symptom. This is about a system that confuses loyalty with silence, that ranks family value by poll numbers, that edits its children like PR copy. A congressman on the panel tried to shift in his seat, clearing his throat as if preparing to interrupt. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because nothing he could say would be louder than the truth already hanging in the room like thunderclouds. Jasmine took a breath, then placed the letters neatly back in the folder. We legislate inheritance, she said, but we ignore erasure. We protect assets, but not acknowledgement. And we have normalized the idea that legacy is a spotlight, not a ledger. The screens behind her came alive. Not with documents this time, but with faces. Black and white portraits of women from across the country holding handwritten signs. I was the daughter who didn't match the image. I was told to stay quiet for the family name. I was erased before I ever asked to be seen. Some in the room lowered their eyes. Others locked their gaze on the screen, unable to look away. Because this wasn't politics anymore. The courtroom had become a mirror, and in it, America saw not just the cracks in the Trump family, but the fractures in its own foundation. Fathers who loved conditionally, families that posed for Christmas cards but cut out the inconvenient, names that disappeared from birth certificates, from property titles, from stories told at dinner tables. This wasn't about law, it was about legacy, and what we're willing to lose to protect a perfect image. Jasmine didn't end with a slogan. She ended with silence. A silence so complete it echoed louder than the gavel that finally fell. Because sometimes the verdict comes long before the vote, and in that room on that day, the truth had already been heard. The only question left was, who had the courage to admit it? He rose before anyone could stop him. Midway through a colleague's closing statement, something about the boundaries of political overreach, Donald J. Trump stood from his seat, adjusted his cufflink, and walked out of room 241. No declaration, no rebuttal, no firework exit, just silence, and the sound of his shoes echoing off the stone floor as the doors closed behind him. He didn't look back. Not at the committee, not at the cameras, not at the daughter sitting in the second row who had once asked only to be seen. For a man who had spent his life branding exits into stages, always scripted, always defiant, this one felt different. There was no victory lap, no deflection tweet queued up, just a man, exposed, and a truth too heavy to spin. And behind him the room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, calm, still. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply reached for the same folder she had carried since this began and gently closed it. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it echoed like a final gavel. She rose and faced the room, not as a victor, but as a witness, one who had carried voices too long left out of the record. If we can see every dollar on a spreadsheet, she said quietly, we can see every name crossed out too. The statement wasn't a jab, it was an invitation, a dare even, for every institution, every dynasty, every family that had ever reduced love to ledger lines and worth to visibility. The room held its breath, not because her words were loud, but because they were undeniable, the kind that don't end conversations, they start them. A few members nodded, others looked away. One, a man whose own daughter hadn't spoken to him in 4 years, blinked slowly and said nothing. Outside, the sky over Washington had turned the color of ash and gold. A storm was coming in from the east, low clouds threatening rain, but not yet. For now, there was only stillness. And through the stillness, screens across the country began to fade to black. But not before one final image. Jasmine walking away from the podium. Tiffany seated quietly, watching her, and the words etched across the closing frame. Truth doesn't burn bridges. It lights the path back to ourselves. No music, no narration. Just that. And somewhere across thousands of living rooms, across laptops, across hospital TVs, and quiet kitchen corners, someone sat back and whispered to no one, I was erased once too. Because this story was never really about one man or one daughter or one document. It was about all of them, about all of us, about the stories we edit, and the ones we bury, and the silence we pass down like heirlooms. It was about what it means to leave someone out, not just of a will, but of a story, and what it means to finally be written back in. The lights dimmed, the feed ended, the screen turned to black. And in white, glowing type, one last question appeared. Quiet, haunting, and necessary. What legacy would you rewrite if you dared? Legacy isn't carved in marble or sealed in gold. It's written in the names we choose to honor, in the voices we choose to hear. This was never just about a daughter forgotten by her father. It was about every one of us who's been told we don't belong, who's been edited out of the story not for who we are, but for who we refuse to become. The true measure of legacy is not who inherits the fortune, but who dares to inherit the truth. If this story struck a chord, don't just scroll, pause, reflect. Share it with someone who knows what it feels like to be silenced, forgotten, or crossed out. Like, comment, and send it to the one who still believes names matter more than legacies. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where the erased are written back in and silence never has the last word. Oh. Tap the bell, because what's coming next doesn't whisper. It challenges. This story is a fictional dramatization, rooted in real erasure, real truths, and the quiet resilience of those who refuse to stay invisible. Any resemblance to actual people or events is either coincidental or uncomfortably deliberate. Thanks for watching. Justice isn't inherited. It's insisted on. This is Harrison Stories.